Well, good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you're coming from. My name is Jay McClung with Sepio, and I'm the sales manager for Federal. On the call, we also have Andrew Callan from ClearShark. Andrew, would you like to say hello?
Yeah, hi everyone. Andrew Callan, systems engineer on the ClearShark side, supporting Department of Energy. Nice to see everyone on the call.
Excellent, good. So we're going to talk about something new today. This is a technology that was created by Sepio, and it delivers complete visibility over IT, OT, IoT, and USB connected devices, whether they're connected through Wi-Fi, through Ethernet, or through USB on endpoints. Sepio is able uniquely to detect all connected devices because we use an entirely new methodology pulling data from layer one. And what we're going to talk about today is why layer one is a definitive data source for detecting assets, and the wanted and wanted assets will be detected. So Andrew, if you'd move to the next slide, please. So first of all, Sepio delivers complete visibility, as I mentioned. Once we have visibility, then we can identify devices and begin to apply policies for control. So let's say there's a really good policy that says no spoofed network devices should be allowed. Unlike other tools, Sepio can detect and identify devices that are spoofing their identity. I'll tell you how we do that in a minute. But in that case, it would be a likely threat, so we would want to mitigate that quickly. Rogue device mitigation, whether it is a supply chain compromised device, whether it is a hidden tap, a spoof device, perhaps a manipulated USB peripheral, those devices would be driven with mitigation. Andrew, next page. So let me talk for a moment about where Sepio fits into the OSI model. So there are plenty of tools from layer 7 and down into layer 2 somewhat that are used to secure the enterprise. There's a blind spot at layer 1. And I'll give you some examples of why that blind spot is important. We'll show you some use cases. But until Sepio came along with this technology, there was no way to have visibility at layer 1. And what Sepio is going to do, what it does do, is use the physical layer characteristics to detect and identify devices with machine learning and big data. So when a device connects to a switch, to a Wi-Fi controller, or to a USB on an endpoint, it emits information to those media that allows that the media picks up, like the switch, for example, the voltage, impedance, noise, jitter, and I'll show you some more of that in a second, but it gives us a data feed that's never been available before, and we're able to detect those devices very quickly using that methodology. It's very easy to deploy. We have a very rich fingerprinting technology. It allows us to have a noise-resilient fingerprint, so if things degrade over time, that's okay because our machine learning and big data helps to keep the devices where they belong, grouped and identified properly. So if you would please move to the next slide, Andrew. So I mentioned fingerprints before. So as I mentioned, when a device connects, a switch picks up information from those connected devices on each port, for example, such as you see here, voltage, capacitance, noise, jitter, etc. There are between 30 and 50, 60 elements that we pick up depending on the device type, and it allows us to take that information and uniquely fingerprint each device. We don't care what a device claims to be. If a device says, hey, I'm a Microsoft mouse, we'll be able to see if it's actually an HID rogue device and be able to mitigate that device based on what it actually is, not what it claims to be. So one of the things that we're able to do is detect devices that just simply don't match. We understand we have over 100 million fingerprints in our knowledge base. We have quite a rich set of fingerprints to work from, but there's always something new or something different. So we want to call devices out that are really odd. and make sure that we can take a better look at those. So if you could move to the next slide, please, Andrew. So here's some examples of devices that Sepio sees that other tools simply cannot see. Because we're using the electronic fingerprints of devices, we're able to detect, for example, passive taps, Mac-less devices, out-of-band taps, for example. Now in this case, we have a tap and an unmanaged switch. Sepio can detect these because they affect the electric fingerprint that is captured by the port on the endpoint, on the switch. So what happens is we are able to detect a device that's hanging out there just on the wire because it affects that data set, the metadata, that the switch that we're collecting from the switches. The other way to find these is visually. Somebody might raise their hand and say, yeah, of course I've got a shadow IT device out here, or I've put a hidden tap in your network, but that's unlikely, whereas Sepio will see these immediately. Andrew, next slide. Here's a couple of slightly more interesting examples. This top one here is an inline tap. It is operating out of band. It has no MAC address. And what happened was one of our, now they're a customer, Tier 1 bank in the United States was notified that they were leaking, that they had a leak. And they were doing their due diligence for a long time trying to figure out where it was. They looked at the software, they looked at their firewalls, they looked at everything, inbound, outbound communications. They could not find what was going on. But they installed Sepio. It's a Docker image. It takes approximately an hour to install. As soon as it gets the read credentials to pull that metadata that I mentioned to fingerprint from the switches or the Wi-Fi controller, it starts detecting devices and identifying them. So what we found in the first couple of hours was between the chief financial officer's printer and the switch, there was this man-in-the-middle configuration where from the switch it came in through this little pack of gum size tap, and it was operating out of band. Through the tap, it went out through a cellular modem to the adversary's cloud. It came for whatever they were going to do with it, record it, manipulate it, didn't matter. Comes in through the second cellular modem, through a similar tap, and then onto the printer. So it was completely undetectable. There was no way to see these devices. Sepio detected them because we could see the fingerprints of devices that showed up on that switch port. We were able to tell them where these were. We found 17 more of these in the bank, so at executive level, pardon me. Sorry about that. My dog is getting excited with someone at the door. Please forgive me. I apologize for that. You wouldn't have been able to hear me there. The second example here was with NASA in 2019. What occurred was their network access controller was looking at what appeared to be a Dell PC. And the reason it thought it was a Dell PC was simply because the MAC address said, I'm a Dell PC. The traffic looked similar to a PC, but as it turns out, it was actually a Raspberry Pi spoofing the MAC address of a Dell PC. It's impossible for a NAC to identify this device because the NAC relies on the MAC address from devices and they trust what the device claims to be. Similarly, on endpoints, the EDR, DLP, they're looking at the vendor ID and product ID in order to identify devices. If a device is spoofing the vendor ID and product ID, they are undetectable. Well, let's go to the next slide. This is an example of an air-gap network breach. This is an energy company in Europe. They're now a Sepio customer. They've been receiving through their normal supply chain peripherals just like anything else. They deployed the peripherals. Sepio discovered that they had Microsoft mice that had been manipulated, and on board here is a Raspberry Pi Zero with cellular functionality and whatever you could do through a USB port with a microcomputer attached. that's what that adversary could do. We found more of these in the enterprise, but this was particularly interesting because it was in an air-gapped network. We detected this based on the physical fingerprint of the device. Next slide. One of the concerns with our government customers and contractors is NDAA Section 889, the Chinese devices that are not allowed on the network. Let's say, for example, you buy cameras, you get a load of cameras in and deploy them. They say they're made in Texas. When you connect them to your network, they're made by Huawei, for example. Sepio is going to call that out and go, you have this many Huawei cameras on these ports, on these switches in your network. And that would drive your mitigation efforts. So we're fingerprinting, we're growing our knowledge base around these Chinese devices that violate NDAA Section 889, and that's continuing to grow. We hope that's an important feature for you. Andrew, next slide. So here's some examples. The top one, this picture is not a malicious configuration, but what we have here is a PC that's using a Logitech keyboard and mouse wireless. And because they're using the Logitech device, we know that there are multiple vulnerabilities. There's 7 remote vulnerabilities where this device can be manipulated. And I think it's from up to 100 feet away, but it's a nasty little thing. So what we're looking for are vulnerable devices, not just manipulated and rogue devices, but we're looking for vulnerabilities with devices that are out there in the world. And we're highlighting those vulnerabilities by calling out an endpoint as being vulnerable or risky. And we also, when we look at the endpoint, we see what device connected is causing that vulnerability. Now, there are other tools here that these are hacking tools or red team tools. For example, storage devices. We think that storage devices, that we've kind of got that whipped because we tell people don't plug them into government machines. In 2019, DHS did a survey of a number of facilities, government facilities, and they did what you think would not work. They peppered these USB drives around parking lots, etc. Within 3 days, over 60% of these devices were plugged into a government machine. And those that had an official-looking government logo on them, it went up to over 90% plugged in within 3 days. Now, this device right here could be a rubber ducky. A rubber ducky is a human input device, an HID device. It is a keystroke injection tool. When someone plugs one of these things in, it just starts running a script. And with that script, it can download payloads. There's tons of things that you can do with a rubber ducky. But these devices to Sepio show up as a malicious device because of their fingerprint. Their digital, their electronic fingerprint is different than a legitimate device. So typically a device like this would be coded to have their vendor ID and product ID look like a legitimate device, like say a Microsoft mouse or a Microsoft keyboard, etc. And the EDR and DLP will ignore them because those devices are acceptable. Sepio would initiate a blocking of these devices, and they can be blocked within 50 milliseconds by Sepio. So we're looking for these rogue devices, and we don't trust what a device claims to be. We know what a device is because its electronic fingerprint is its real identity. It's kind of like its DNA. Over here on the right, this is an interesting one, charging cable. These charging cables, they're OMG cables, for example, and they were developed by our security services, and they got into the public domain. So these devices can actually have cellular functionality into the plug end. They can deliver payloads. They can be remotely manipulated from anywhere in the world through the cellular connection. And they're activated. As soon as they're activated by someone plugging a device into that cord, we will see that it's a malicious device and we can block it within 50 milliseconds. So these are other tools. There's mouse jack. There's tools that they can plug into an Ethernet port anywhere in the environment. They can plug into USB. Sepio looks for these devices, and where no other tools can see them, Sepio can detect, identify, and block those devices. So Andrew, if you move to the next slide. I'd like to talk briefly about the architecture for how the system works. Alexa likes me. So here we go. On the network side, there's no agents required. We don't require traffic monitoring. Everything that we need, we're able to pull as metadata from the switches. So it's a very lightweight touch to the network. We're pulling very small amounts of data from the switches through SSH show commands that are very specific and very limited. We don't see any identifiable information. No attribution is available to Sepio, and Sepio can be deployed completely on premise with the knowledge base. So with the network, we're looking at the Wi-Fi, we're looking at the switches, and we will detect all devices that are connected. And if you're running Sepio, we'll also tell you about devices that were connected and where they were seen. On the endpoints, we have an agent that gives you 50 millisecond blocking of rogue devices. We have agentless, and that works anywhere, by the way. Agentless is when a device is attached to the network. Our system reaches out with Windows RM remote management services to pull the USB and pull the metadata that we need. And the third way is through session-based. And a session, imagine you're doing a VPN connection and you're going through a stack of things like, is it our machine? Is it patched? Is it our user? Do they have the credentials? Do they have the biometrics or whatever else they need to connect? And today they get on. With the addition of Sepio, Sepio will inspect that endpoint to make sure there are no rogue devices connected to that device that you're planning to allow in through the VPN. So Sepio has many types of integrations, as you see here, but we also have a very rich, open, RESTful API that allows us to tie in and feed pretty much any system with a layer 1 data feed that heretofore has never been available. So with this, I'd like to pause, and Andrew, I'm going to stop sharing. And you can stop my sharing, and you can move into the. Oh, go ahead. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So thanks very much, Jay. So there are 8 zero trust pillars that are defined by the GSA documentation. I'm not going to go into all of them simply because no singular technology or vendor is really going to be applicable in every single pillar. Zero trust is not a single vendor approach, but the ones that you see on screen here are the pillars pertinent to what Sepio can do and enhanced by the abilities that they provide. One of them that may have seemed obvious, but is not on here, is that networking pillar. We obviously saw a lot of networking devices in the previous slides, but what that pillar is really looking at is the isolation of sensitive resources from being accessed by unauthorized devices. So Sepio focuses more on the rogue device mitigation rather than the microsegmentation piece and the encryption that's outlined in the network pillar. So that's why that one isn't on screen. So I want to dive a little bit deeper into the device, infrastructure, and visibility and analytics pillars and show the ways that Sepio can help address each of these ideas in zero trust. So device, firstly, Sepio is uniquely positioned to give a true non-fungible state of devices connected to the network. They focus on identifying devices by the physical characteristics of the device. So we're talking about impedance, voltage, line rate, which unlike IP addresses or MAC addresses, they cannot be spoofed. It's either a Dell R640 server, for example, and it's communicating like one, or it's not, and it's flagged as a potential masquerading or rogue device. And we do this with read-only permissions to network infrastructure, which allows us to very quickly bring in a true list of all devices across our network. We cross-reference that with a list of our virtual machines and cloud assets. We have an authoritative record of IT assets across our enterprise. Sepio also provides vulnerability management with the callouts of peripherals that have known weaknesses and the amount of them that exist across the network, which can potentially lead to compromised hosts or endpoints or devices. We can also detect spoofed peripherals that communicate with the host in a manner that is not expected by what they claim to be. As Jay mentioned, that is shut off within 50 milliseconds. One example of this would be the keyloggers that have been built into keyboards as part of a supply chain attack, possibly. So device security is a core function of the Sepio technology, and it's a direct result of their focus on rogue device mitigation. The infrastructure pillar, this focuses on ensuring that systems and services within a workload are protected against unintended and unauthorized access, as well as from potential vulnerability. So we did just mention that vulnerability protection that Sepio provides. But when we look at how workloads are currently deployed, the current set of cyber tools in use, we don't have protections against advanced rogue devices that are connected to our networks. So Sepio's technology provides precisely that. We can detect devices that are masquerading in our networks, those that are potentially causing unauthorized access to internal systems, which could take the form of a Raspberry Pi, which is physically connected to our networks, masquerading as server infrastructure, but instead it's being used as a wireless access point for attackers to gain entry into the network. This could also take the form of a man-in-the-middle device harvesting data and credentials from keyboards so that attackers can use that later. So Sepio picks up any device based on unfakeable photoelectric signals used by the devices to communicate. If there's an invisible Macless device that is in line with any piece of the infrastructure, if there's a potentially vulnerability-inducing device masquerading as something that we have approved on our networks, if there is a device with vulnerable connected peripherals, Sepio can find it and it can connect with other industry tools to remove it from the network. As mentioned before, not only do we get rogue device mitigation from Sepio, but we have a true record of all connected physical assets on our network. So we get visibility at layer 1, where essentially every other tool out there right now stops at layer 2, which means they can be fooled by the devices that Sepio is designed to hunt down. We get visibility into our networks at the very base level, without any rogue devices being able to trick sensors, remaining undetected, and the reporting capabilities from Sepio, as you'll see in the demo in just a moment, this allows us to see new devices connected to the network so that we aren't constantly sifting through large lists of devices. We can instead focus on at-risk devices, making sure that we're given pertinent information and relevant data while we still maintain total visibility across the network. So that is that from the slides piece. I want to move over into the Sepio demo here. So thank you very much for paying attention to the slides. But at the moment, I want to get into the Sepio platform, give everyone an idea of the kind of information that is provided by Sepio's unique visibility approach. I actually want to start on the asset visibility page, from which we can see every single connected device in one table. This list will include peripherals, it will include network connected devices, wireless devices, anything that has a physical interaction with our enterprise. So we can filter from the top left here. We can look at only keyboards, only mice, only USB devices. If we scroll a bit further down, we can look at OT and industrial control system devices and filter by that. We can also look at the connection type and filter by this. So if we only want to see USB connected devices, if we only want to see wired connected devices on the network, or if we only want to see wireless devices. So this layer 1 approach gives us total visibility over what's connected to our network. If it's malicious, rogue, or a masquerading device, it's not able to fool Sepio like it can with traditional network access control solutions. From this page, we can also focus on specific time ranges, when it was first and most recently seen. Is it online now? So we can sort these devices with the associated risk score. And we have a description in the box just next to that. So you'll see here this Microsoft mouse that's connected to one of our hosts may not be a masquerading device or anything like that, but it does have a vulnerability to the mouse jack exploit. And it's important to note here that currently deployed EDR tools aren't going to be able to detect that a plugged-in device is not what it says it is. So when you pull data from an EDR source, it's going to appear exactly as the device it's masquerading as, since EDR tools are not designed to look at the physical aspects of connected devices. And we'll see one of those masquerading devices under this page here. This is generally the first page you see when you log in. I wanted to begin on the previous page just because it shows the level of visibility that Sepio brings to the enterprises. And since this is a zero trust focused webinar, visibility is such a really important piece to zero trust architectures. I wanted to highlight that on the first page there. On this dashboard, however, we get visuals on our device compliance posture and status, how many might be violating policy. So we may have a whitelist of particular devices, how many of our endpoints are actually staying consistent with that list. How many of them are online? How many of them are connected? We can see our distribution of vendors over on the side here. But I want to draw attention to this hosts to notice panel. So we have a list of hosts here displayed with varying degrees of risk. Some of them have a large number of unapproved peripherals. The one at the top here is slightly more interesting. That's where we're going to see one of these masquerading devices. So according to the vendor and product ID, it should be a Dell keyboard. But because of those physical layer characteristics that that Sepio picks up, we can tell that this is actually a Bash Bunny device. And Sepio is able to detect that from those physical layer characteristics. They've cataloged those characteristics of both legitimate quiet keyboards, that of Bash Bunnies, and we can tell based on these qualities that this device is non-legitimate. Just to deviate very quickly from that Sepio interface, I want to show you one of these Bash Bunny devices. These can be ordered online. They are relatively inexpensive, especially given the amount of budget that's given to nation-state attackers. This is very insignificant. Most importantly, however, they don't require a technically savvy person to actually execute the attack. Payloads are readily available online for these. The execution of the attack is as simple as plugging it in and waiting. Again, it doesn't have to be IT staff that are equipped to execute an attack with one of these. It could be janitorial staff, HVAC contractors, anyone that has access to a data center, even temporarily, could compromise a host with one of these devices. So moving back to the dashboard there, if we look at other forms of risk-inducing devices, we look at device security and the peripherals page, we can see, based on all of these connected devices, that there are some devices that may be what they say they are, but they have vulnerabilities that can still compromise the device they're connected to and introduce risk to our networks. Again, there's some of them with the mouse jack vulnerability. This just means that it can be compromised by malicious actors. And since it's wireless, these can operate up to, I think it's 300 feet away. And again, relatively inexpensive devices that are required to compromise these. Again, EDR solutions that are currently deployed, they see these devices as a whitelisted device and it allows them to connect. Sepio highlights this risk and it can both alert on and interrupt communication from these vulnerable or compromised devices. So that's a quick coverage of hosts and endpoint connected device visibility and protection. So if we look at the networking side, we look at a networking infrastructure that we've got connected. These are all of the switches that Sepio has been credentialed for and is able to read from. We'll see that some of these have all green ports. That means that there's no particular violations. But the ones with red ports, we will see that there are some ports that have been alarmed on. So on this one, we see that Fast Ethernet port 2 has had an alarm triggered. Why is that? If we look at the detail here, we can see that the device plugged in, when we look at the MAC address at the layer 2 characteristics, it appears to be a Dell PC. But Sepio sees past that MAC address into the physical layer, and we can see that it's spoofing that MAC address. It's actually communicating like a Raspberry Pi. In some organizations, we might be all right with Raspberry Pis being connected. It might be sensors, it might be for research, it might be for a project. in no world should we be okay without investigating at the very least with Raspberry Pis being connected that are pretending to be Dell PCs. That should absolutely be called into question. So we need the visibility that Sepio provides, often in addition to network access control solutions, since they can't see devices like this or the others that Sepio detects. So if we look at a few others, we go back to the networking infrastructure page. I think this has a fair amount of alarms here. A couple of ports that are all right. We might have some actual PCs connected. They're communicating like PCs. We're not alerting on those. But if we have a look at port 10 here, we've got a Shark Jack device. Again, this is another relatively inexpensive device that rather than plugging in via USB is just plugged in via an Ethernet port. This shows no MAC address detectable. So on any platform besides Sepio, this would be a completely invisible device. Any visibility focused technology that is not looking at layer 1 will not see this device because it doesn't look at the physical characteristics that have changed on this port because a MAC-less device is connected. So that SharkJack device, that's a tool that plugs into an Ethernet port. It can attack predetermined targets. It can perform recon. It can harvest and exfiltrate data. Again, it is not something, and we'll see here, it's not something that needs a technical person to deploy. Someone could pay, an HVAC employee or something like that, thousands of dollars just to stick this into an empty Ethernet port when their escort isn't looking. And we have an immediate risk that isn't being picked up by any of the current network access control solutions. Another one of these, we have another Raspberry Pi device that is saying that it's classed as a PC. We have another one that is masquerading as a printer. We can click on the reporting for alarmed ports for a condensed view of all of these violations that we see connecting into our switches. So Sepio's user accounts on the switches that we're collecting information from are read-only, but they can integrate with the network access control solutions that they're augmenting to enforce change and quarantine these risky devices. So that's the kind of visibility that we're getting, something that is not provided by anything, at the very least that I've seen, that's deployed in the enterprise today. Looking at specific risk insights that Sepio is able to provide, we look at the vulnerable peripherals that are connected. We'll get not only vulnerable, but rogue as well. We see the names of the devices, the risk that they pose, as well as the quantity that's been detected in our protected devices, as well as the devices that they're connected to. So we get the same information about peripherals connected to endpoints that are vulnerable to particular attacks. Other vulnerabilities we can see on the switch vulnerabilities, which is the next page I'll go into. We see a list of the different families of switch operating systems, models that have been deployed that are being read by Sepio. And we have a heat map here of different amounts of switches we have that have CVEs affecting them. And there is some intelligence built into this. If there's a vulnerability with the Telnet protocol, for example, but by best practice, we should have Telnet disabled, that's not going to show up and affect our score. So we do have some ability to filter out those CVEs that aren't affecting us. We look at the event log. This is just a log of every single occurrence that Sepio has seen across the switches it's reading from. We see a full stream of that, and we have DVR capability, basically, of seeing when devices were connected within a given time frame. So I could filter that down here. If we are looking for devices that were connected on a particular day, we can see this one was connected on March, well, actually today. So if we look at, devices that have been connected within the last day, we can see all of these fall on today. So if we were looking for weekly reports to be sent out to C-level execs, we could filter down on the risk level. We could filter down on details of events that Sepio has seen and have this sent out to the appropriate people. So we can do that by looking at reports. We can schedule a report. We can start running it every day. We can run it on a schedule and have that sent out via email, via PDF, via CSV to the appropriate individuals. So that is a quick overview of the.
May I interrupt for a second?
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead.
Could you go to an endpoint and just open up an endpoint so we can see all the components that are in an endpoint?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll go back to that demo machine.
Yeah. So within a desktop, a notebook, there are many devices that are internal, particularly in notebooks, like the built-in camera, the built-in microphone. You can have devices that are connected additionally through USB, for example. With Sepio, you can actually define a list of approved peripherals that are allowed in your enterprise, and any other peripherals other than the approved peripherals, if they're connected, they simply will not work. Sepio will not allow those devices to work. As soon as they're unplugged and a legitimate or approved device is plugged in, they will work. But another use case with that is, let's say there's a part of the network that you do not want microphones and cameras to function, regardless of how they're connected, built in or not. You can define that policy, and Sepio will disable those cameras and microphones and all of those machines, regardless of what the user may do to configure it through the operating system. We block it before the operating system even sees it. So if you look inside this machine, you can see there are many types of devices that are connected, and Sepio is looking for risky and vulnerable devices in your endpoints as well. But Andrew, I kind of jumped in there. I'd like to see what you'd like to add, please.
No, I think you covered it very well there. I was pretty much at the end there. So if there was anything else that you really wanted to highlight, I can navigate there. Otherwise, I think we would be ready for any questions.
We have a couple more people from Sepio on the call. Chen, for example, if you have any comments you'd like to add, we've got a little time here at the end.
No, I don't have anything to add. I just want to make sure that you address the last question, Jay.
Yes, so a Dell keyboard. So I see this. Sepio will detect. No, I wrote the answer to it, but how does the system know, for example, a HID device like Hack5 Bash Bunny is set to a footprint that is used by the host, and we approved a Dell keyboard? So what Sepio is doing is we're not looking at the device to self-identify. We don't trust hardware. We don't believe what it claims to be. Sepio, once again, is pulling the physical electronic fingerprint, the voltage, impedance, noise, jitter, capacitance, those factors, and we use that to fingerprint, and then the machine learning and big data actually identify that device. So we're very quick to figure out if a device is not what it claims to be. So because we know what a good device looks like, and we know what bad devices look like, so we're able to detect that that's a Bash Bunny. We can even call it out by name. That's a Bash Bunny. It's not a keyboard. I hope that answers the question, but please follow up. You're welcome to unmute yourself if you like. We can discuss it. And we have time for questions if anyone wants to unmute and ask for clarification or give us an example of something. We'd be glad to take your answer, take your question. Well, it looks like we might give you a little bit of time back today. Certainly appreciate everyone joining and your attention. We would love to follow up, and if you have any questions, I believe we'll send a copy of this presentation out to those who attended today. And we're willing to meet and dig into further details anytime. So thank you very much for your time today. I appreciate it very much.